My name is Eleanor Bennett. I'm 59 years old, and at my own husband's funeral, my son whispered in my ear that I shouldn't expect a single penny from his father's $68 million fortune. What he didn't know was that my husband's final lesson was about to cost him everything. It's a long story, but one I feel I have to tell. Before I begin, I'd love to know where you're all reading this from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It makes me feel a little less alone knowing there are kind hearts out there listening. Drop a comment below while you get comfortable. The day we buried my husband, William, the world was dressed in black. A sea of somber suits and dark dresses ebbed and flowed around me, a tide of polite murmurs and sorrowful glances. But I stood as an island of defiance in a dress the color of a summer sunset. It was a deep, vibrant crimson, the silk whispering against my skin with every cold gust of wind that swept across the manicured lawns of the cemetery. It was William's favorite. He'd bought it for me on our 30th anniversary, his eyes lighting up when I had first tried it on in a little boutique in Paris. "Eleanor," he'd said, his voice thick with the same awe I'd heard on our wedding day, "you were born to live in color, not in shadows." And so I wore color to honor him. To honor the brilliant, vibrant life he had lived, not the gray finality of his death. Of course, not everyone understood. The whispers followed me like a trail of smoke. Inappropriate. Tasteless. Has she no shame? I heard them, but I didn't let them touch me. My grief was a private ocean, vast and deep, and I would not let their shallow puddles of judgment ripple its surface. "Oh, Eleanor, you're so brave," my sister-in-law, Carol, murmured, clutching my arm. Her grip was a little too tight, her nails digging slightly into my skin. Her eyes, magnified by her thick glasses, scanned my dress with a look that was more judgment than sympathy. "But this color, perhaps it's a little much for the occasion?" I offered her a calm smile, one that didn't quite reach my aching heart. "Today's for celebrating William's life, not mourning his absence. Don't you think, Carol?" I said, my voice even. I was honoring the man who filled my life with color, not the void he left behind. She recoiled slightly, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes before it was masked again by practiced grief. It was then that I saw them approaching, my son, Michael, and his wife, Victoria. Michael was 38, my only child. He had his father's height and handsome features, but lately a hardness had crept into his eyes, a brittle arrogance I didn't recognize. Victoria was latched onto his arm, a sleek, designer-clad shadow. Her face was a perfect mask of sorrow, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. They'd been married for 5 years, and in those 5 years, I'd watched my son transform from a warm, caring young man into this cold, entitled stranger. "Mom," Michael said, his tone flat. He leaned in for a stiff, awkward hug that felt more like a formality than an embrace. Victoria mirrored the gesture, her cheek barely brushing mine, her perfume cloying and expensive. "We're just so worried about you," she said, her voice a saccharine whisper that grated on my raw nerves. I pulled back, looking at my son. Really looking at him. "I'm managing," I told him, my voice softer than I intended. He nodded, but his gaze drifted over my shoulder, already scanning the crowd, networking even at his own father's funeral. Then he leaned in close, as if to share a secret comfort. His breath was warm against my ear, but his words were shards of ice. "Mom, for what it's worth, I hope you've been smart with your savings. Don't expect a penny from Dad's $68 million inheritance. It's our turn to run things now." The world tilted. The polite murmurs of the mourners faded into a dull roar. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the words, it was the casual cruelty, the dismissive smirk I could feel in his tone. He was staking his claim on his father's grave, and in the same breath erasing my entire life with William, my 59 years, my partnership in building everything we had. I was no longer a mother, a wife, a partner.
I was an obstacle, a line item on a balance sheet to be zeroed out. Victoria's eyes met mine over Michael's shoulder. There was no sympathy there, only a cold, triumphant glint. She had won. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. A strange glacial calm settled over me. The grief for my husband was still there, a gaping wound in my soul. But now a new feeling crystallized around it, a cold, hard resolve. I pulled away from my son and looked him squarely in the eye. I saw a stranger looking back, a man whose reflection had been warped by greed. He seemed momentarily taken aback by the stillness in my gaze, the absence of the heartbroken tears he'd clearly expected. He didn't know his father as I did. He saw William as a walking bank account, a legacy of money to be claimed. He didn't know that William, my brilliant, loving William, was always 10 steps ahead. He saw the end of his father's life as his beginning. He had no idea that he was about to get his father's final lesson, and I, his mother, would be the one to teach it. The reception after the funeral was held at our home, a place that suddenly felt too big, too quiet. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and catered food. I moved through the rooms in a daze, accepting condolences from friends and business associates, my son's cruel whisper echoing in my mind. I saw Michael and Victoria holding court in the living room, surrounded by a small group of their friends. They weren't grieving, they were performing. Michael spoke in a low, authoritative voice, gesturing with a glass of whiskey, while Victoria nodded elegantly, a hand resting proprietorially on his arm. They looked like the new king and queen of an empire they had yet to inherit. My own home had become their stage. I needed air. I slipped out onto the patio, the cool evening air a welcome relief. It was there, hidden by the shadows of a large potted fig tree, that I heard their voices again, drifting from the open French doors. "It's all settled," Michael was saying to David, his childhood friend. "Dad's lawyer, Thomas Whitmore, will call us in for the reading next week. It's just a formality." 68 million, man. That's insane, David said, his voice envious. Victoria laughed, sound like tiny, sharp bells. "Don't forget the portfolio and the properties. It's probably closer to 75. We're thinking of buying a place in Miami first because Michael deserves a break after all this stress." The word stress hung in the air, a grotesque insult to the man they were supposedly mourning. Then came the words that sealed my resolve. "What about your mom?" David asked, a sliver of concern in his voice. "Will she be okay?"
Michael scoffed. "She'll be fine. She hasn't had to worry about money a day in her life. Dad took care of everything. She's been living off his success for decades. It's our turn now. She can sell her little art pieces or something." My breath hitched. My little art pieces. Before I married William, I was a promising artist with gallery representation. I gave it all up, not because he asked, but because I wanted to. I poured my creativity and energy into supporting his dream, hosting dinners for investors, designing his office spaces, being his partner in every sense of the word. We built our life together, brick by brick. And to my son, I was nothing more than a freeloader. The next morning, I was in Thomas Whitmore's office. The room was paneled in dark wood and lined with books, a quiet sanctuary of law and order. Thomas had been William's lawyer and his best friend for 40 years. He was a kind man with wise, sad eyes. "Eleanor, I am so sorry for your loss," he said, his voice gentle. "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm not here for condolences. I'm here for answers. Michael told me I shouldn't expect anything." Thomas's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the large mahogany desk. "William saw this coming, Eleanor. For the past year, he was heartbroken. He saw the change in Michael. He saw Victoria's influence. He slid a leather-bound journal across the desk. He asked me to give this to you. He started writing it 6 months ago." My hands trembled as I opened it. It was William's handwriting, neat and precise. It was a log, a painful diary of slights and demands. Entries detailed Michael asking for a $100,000 loan for one of Victoria's vanity projects, his dismissive attitude about a sentimental family vacation, his impatience with William's failing health. Each entry was a small cut, a paper cut, on my husband's loving heart. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before he died. "I spoke with Thomas today," he wrote. "I have failed as a father if my son only sees my value in dollars. My final legacy cannot be to reward his greed. It must be a lesson, a hard one. I only pray Eleanor has the strength to see it through. She is the strongest person I know." Tears finally streamed down my face, hot and silent. They weren't tears of grief for myself, but for the pain William had carried alone. "He prepared 2 wills, Eleanor," Thomas explained softly. "The first one, written 5 years ago, split everything between you and Michael. It's the one Michael knows about. But he signed a new one, a final one, 6 months ago." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "He left everything to you." I looked up, stunned. "Everything," Thomas repeated. "The company, the properties, the entire $68 million estate. It's all yours. And for Michael?" He pushed a single sealed envelope across the desk. "He gets this. And $1. The will is ironclad. But William wanted more than just to cut him off. He wanted him to understand why. That's what's in the letter." A plan began to form in my mind, a cold, clear strategy rising from the ashes of my grief. It wasn't just William's plan anymore. It was mine. "Thomas," I said, my voice gaining a strength I hadn't felt in years, "when is the official reading?" "I was planning for the end of next week." "No," I said, closing the journal. "Postpone it. Tell them there's a delay with the paperwork. I need time." Thomas looked at me, a question in his eyes. "William wanted to teach Michael a lesson," I said, the cold resolve from the funeral returning, hardening into steel. "But a lesson is useless if the student isn't ready to learn. Michael and Victoria believe they are about to become kings. I think we should let them play the part for a little while. Give them enough rope, Thomas. Let's see what they do with it." Thomas studied my face for a long moment, and then a slow, grim smile spread across his lips. "William was right," he said. "You were the strongest person I know." The 7 days that followed felt like a lifetime. I was living in a strange, bifurcated reality. To the outside world, I was the grieving widow, fragile and lost. But inside, I was a general preparing for war. My grief for William was the fuel, and my son's betrayal was the flint that sparked a fire I thought had long been extinguished. My plan was simple in its design, but required a level of self-control I didn't know I possessed. I had to become the person Michael and Victoria already believed I to be, a helpless, clueless woman who had never handled a checkbook and was overwhelmed with the complexities of the world outside her gilded cage. On the first day, I invited them over for dinner. I can't bear to be alone in this big house," I said over the phone, letting my voice crack just enough. "Of course, Mom," he said, a touch of impatience in his voice. "We'll be there at 7. Don't go to any trouble." But I did go to trouble. I made William's favorite meal, roast chicken with rosemary and lemon, and I set the dining room table with our best china. I needed the familiar rituals to ground me, to remind me of the family we once were. When they arrived, Victoria swept into the room, her eyes doing a quick, dismissive inventory of the decor. "It's so classic," she said, which is her way of calling it old-fashioned. Dinner was a strained affair. I picked at my food, playing my part. I asked Michael simple questions about the estate, feigning confusion. I found a letter about probate,
I asked, mispronouncing the word slightly. It all seems so complicated. Michael waved a dismissive hand. Don't you worry about that, Mom. That's what I'm here for. Victoria and I have it all under control. He spoke as if I were a child. It was infuriating, but I swallowed my anger and gave him a watery, grateful smile. The real performance came after dinner. I led them into William's study, the heart of our home. It was filled with his books, his scent, his presence. I I was trying to sort through some of his papers, I said, gesturing vaguely to the large oak desk. I don't know what's important and what's not. And there it was. The bait. Lying on the corner of the desk, slightly separated from a pile of mundane bills, was a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I had spent the afternoon creating it. On the front, in gold leaf, I had embossed 2 words: Northwood Project. It was, of course, completely fictitious. Inside, I had placed old architectural drawings from a renovation we had done years ago, some geological survey maps I'd found in a box, and a few pages of financial projections I had typed up myself, using impressive but ultimately meaningless jargon. As I had hoped, Michael's eyes locked onto it. He said, "What's this?" His voice casual, but a predatory gleam in his eyes. I played my part. "Oh, that old thing," I said with a sigh. "It was some passion project of your father's. Something about undeveloped land up north. He was always dreaming. But now that he's gone," I let my voice trail off, a picture of hopeless resignation.
He picked it up, his fingers tracing the gold letters. Victoria moved to his side, peering at the contents. I could almost see the dollar signs lighting up in their eyes. A secret project, an off-the-books asset, something the clueless widow didn't even know she had. "He never mentioned this to me," Michael said, a new sharp edge to his voice. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was a prospector who had just struck a new vein of gold. "He had so many ideas," I said softly, turning away to hide the cold satisfaction on my face. "I can't keep track." I watched them from the doorway as they huddled over the fake portfolio, whispering excitedly. The bait had been taken. I had given their greed a new target, a hidden treasure they believed only they were smart enough to find. This would make them bolder, more reckless. They wouldn't just be spending the $68 million in their heads. They'd be spending this imaginary windfall, too. That night, after they left, I sat alone in William's study. The silence was profound. I missed my husband with an ache that was physical. I missed his laughter, his steady presence, the way he would take my hand and tell me everything would be all right. But as I looked at the empty space where the Northwood Project portfolio had been, Michael had taken it, to look over for me, he'd said. I didn't feel entirely alone. I felt William's presence in the quiet hum of the house, in the strength flowing through my veins. This wasn't just my fight. It was ours. I was the executor of his final wish, the guardian of his true legacy. And the lesson was just beginning. The next 2 days were a masterclass in deception. I had to lie not only to my enemies, but also to my friends. And that was a far heavier burden to bear. On the 3rd day, my best friend, Sarah, came over. We had been friends since college, 2 halves of a whole for over 40 years. She was the one person on earth, besides William, who knew the real me. She arrived with a casserole in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other, her face etched with genuine concern. "Ellie, you look exhausted," she said, pulling me into a fierce hug. We sat in the kitchen, the heart of the home, and for a while I let myself just be with my friend. I let her hold my hand while I cried, real tears this time for the man I had lost. But the conversation inevitably turned to Michael. "I have to tell you, Ellie, I'm worried," Sarah said, her brow furrowed. "My cousin works in commercial real estate downtown.
He told me Michael Bennett was in his office yesterday asking about leasing 3 prime locations for a new restaurant franchise. He was talking like the money was already in the bank. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was happening even faster than I had anticipated. He was already signing contracts, making commitments. And that's not all, Sarah continued, leaning closer. He was with his wife. My cousin said she was the one doing most of the talking, pushing for bigger spaces, more expensive finishes. He said it felt desperate. Here was my moment of truth. My instincts screamed at me to confide in Sarah, to unload the terrible burden of my secret, and have my oldest friend by my side. But I couldn't. One slip of the tongue, one well-meaning but misplaced phone call from her to another friend, and the entire charade could collapse. For the plan to work, Michael and Victoria had to believe I was completely isolated and vulnerable. So I did one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I lied to my best friend. I manufactured a wobbly smile. "Oh, Sarah, you know how Michael is. He gets so ambitious. I think he's just trying to create his own legacy, to step out of his father's shadow. Maybe he's being a little hasty, but his heart is in the right place." Sarah stared at me, her eyes filled with disbelief. "His heart? Ellie, this sounds reckless. What if he loses everything? What about you?" "He would never let anything happen to me," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I trust my son." I saw the hurt in her eyes. I had just shut her out, dismissed her valid concerns with a flimsy platitude. She stayed for another hour, but a wall was now between us. When she left, her hug was less fierce, more hesitant. Watching her car pull out of the driveway, I felt a profound sense of isolation. This path, I realized, was one I had to walk alone. The 4th day brought a different kind of validation from an unexpected ally. Our housekeeper, Maria, had been with us for over 20 years. She was family. She was a quiet, observant woman who saw everything but said little. As she was cleaning the study, she approached me, a dust cloth in her hand. "Mrs. Bennett," she said softly, her eyes downcast. I found this in the wastebasket in the guest room, where Mr. Michael and his wife were making calls." She held out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a receipt from a high-end jewelry store, dated from the day before. Victoria had purchased a 3-carat diamond tennis bracelet. The total was over $50,000. But that wasn't the damning part. Scribbled on the back in Victoria's looping handwriting was a note. "Call new financial advisor. Inquire about post-inheritance asset protection." My blood ran cold. She wasn't just planning to spend William's money. She was already planning how to protect it from Michael once they had it. She was going to cut him out, the same way they were cutting me out. The piranha was going to eat the shark. Maria must have seen the look on my face. "She is not a good woman, Mrs. Bennett," she whispered, her voice fierce with a loyalty that brought tears to my eyes. "Your husband, he was a good man. He deserves better." I folded the receipt and put it in my pocket. It was another piece of ammunition, another confirmation that my path, however lonely, was the correct one. "Thank you, Maria," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for looking out for this family." She simply nodded and went back to her work. But a silent pact had been made between us. In that house of lies, I had found an ally, and she had just handed me a weapon I hadn't even known I needed. The betrayal wasn't just against me. It was a snake eating its own tail, and I was going to make sure it choked. By the 5th day, my home had transformed from a place of mourning into my personal headquarters. I moved with a purpose I hadn't felt in years, my grief channeling itself into a laser-focused strategy. Michael and Victoria thought they were running the show, but they were merely actors on my stage, reading from a script I was writing in real time. My next move was to subtly verify the extent of their recklessness and, if possible, accelerate it. I couldn't act directly. I had to maintain my cover as the helpless widow. But William had taught me a great deal about business over the years, not through direct lessons, but through osmosis. I had listened to his phone calls, read his reports, and sat by his side through countless dinners with partners and rivals. I knew how the game was played.
I started with a phone call to Mr. Chen, one of William's oldest and most respected business partners. I used the pretense of looking for an old photograph of him and William for a memorial album. Eleanor, it's so good to hear your voice, but I wish it were under better circumstances, he said kindly. After a few minutes of pleasantries and shared memories, I steered the conversation. You know, it's funny the things you find when you're cleaning out an office, I said with a light, feigned sigh. William kept files on everyone. I even found one on Michael's friend David, the young man with that tech startup. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. Ah, yes, David, Mr. Chen said, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly. William always tried to encourage Michael's friendships. I continued, my voice laced with false nostalgia. He thought David's company had such potential, a real game changer. This was a calculated lie. I knew from William's journal that he considered David a reckless amateur. Mr. Chen cleared his throat. Well, Eleanor, William was a generous man, but between you and me, I'd be cautious. Tech startups are a volatile market. David's company, TechCore, has been struggling to secure its second round of funding. They're burning through cash at an alarming rate. Oh dear, I said, injecting the perfect amount of surprise into my voice. I do hope Michael isn't getting in over his head. He's so eager to prove himself. I'm sure he'll be fine, Mr. Chen said, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He was a pillar of the financial community. If he started quietly asking questions about Michael Bennett's new ventures, it would create ripples. But I wasn't done. After hanging up with Mr. Chen, I made a bolder move. I drove to a convenience store on the other side of town and bought a prepaid burner phone. That evening, I used it to send a single anonymous text message to a man named Marcus Thorne, a notoriously aggressive venture capitalist whom I knew from William's files had previously passed on investing in David's company. The message was simple. TechCore. Hearing a major influx of cash is coming from Bennett Estate next week. Might be your last chance to get in cheap before their valuation skyrockets after their promotion to the next level. Your loss. It was a gamble. I was pouring gasoline on a fire. If Thorne believed it, his fear of missing out might drive him to reconsider, putting even more pressure on Michael and David to close their deal. It would make Michael feel like a major player, a financial wizard sought after by the big guns. It would inflate his ego to the bursting point. The sixth day was quiet. I spent the day with Maria, sorting through William's clothes, sharing stories. It was a day of genuine mourning, a necessary pause in the midst of my campaign. But even in the quiet, the net was tightening. Late that afternoon, I received a call from Michael. His voice was giddy, high on a cocktail of arrogance and success. "Mom, great news!" he chirped, not even bothering to ask how I was. "You know that little tech investment I was looking into? We just had Marcus Thorne come back to the table. He wants in. This is huge." "Oh, my," I said, my voice a whisper. That's wonderful, dear." "It's more than wonderful. It's a game changer," he crowed. "Dad always played it so safe. It's time to make some real aggressive moves. I'm telling you, in 5 years, we'll have doubled the estate." The casual way he said "we" sent a chill down my spine. "Listen," he said, his voice becoming serious, businesslike. "Thomas's office called. The reading is set for tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Just be there, sign where they tell you to, and we can get the ball rolling on everything. Don't wear that red dress, okay? It's a bit much." The audacity of it, the sheer, unadulterated entitlement left me speechless. "Michael," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "are you absolutely sure about everything you're doing?" He laughed, a condescending, dismissive sound that I would remember for the rest of my life. "Mom, I love you, but you don't understand this world. You've never had to. Just trust me. Your time of worrying is over.
My time is just beginning. When I hung up the phone, my hand was steady. Any lingering trace of doubt, any flicker of motherly hope that I was wrong about him had been extinguished. He hadn't just been influenced by Victoria, he had become her. He saw me as an antique, a relic from a bygone era. He was right about one thing. My time of worrying was over. But my time was far from done. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, his time would run out. The night before the will reading was the longest of my life. The house, usually a comfort, felt like a cage. Every shadow seemed to hold a memory of William, every creak of the floorboards a question. Was I doing the right thing? Was this what he truly wanted? I pulled out his journal again, my fingers tracing the familiar loops of his handwriting. I read the final entry over and over, the words a painful balm on my raw nerves. She is the strongest person I know. He had trusted me. He had believed in my strength even when I had forgotten it myself. This wasn't revenge, it was a promise I had to keep. I couldn't sleep. I wandered into his study and stood before the large portrait we had painted for our 25th anniversary. We looked so young, so full of hope. In the painting, William was looking at me, a soft, loving smile on his face. I reached out and touched the cool canvas. "Oh, William," I whispered into the silence, "I hope I'm doing this right." As if in answer, my eyes fell upon a small locked box on his desk that I had never paid much attention to before. It was a simple rosewood box, unassuming. Tucked into the side of the desk blotter was a tiny ornate key. On impulse, I picked it up and tried the lock. It clicked open. Inside was not what I expected. There were no stock certificates or legal documents. Instead, it was filled with mementos. The cork from a bottle of champagne we'd shared on a special anniversary, a faded ticket stub for the first movie we ever saw, a small smooth stone from the beach where he had proposed, and underneath it all, a small stack of my old sketches, charcoal drawings from before we were married, pieces I thought had been lost long ago. Tucked within the sketches was a single folded sheet of paper. It was a letter written in his familiar script, but this one wasn't for Michael. It was for me. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone and you have found your way into my little box of treasures. I know the coming days will be the hardest of your life. I am so sorry to have left you with this burden, this terrible task. I have watched our son change, and it has been the greatest sorrow of my life. Greed is a poison, and I fear Victoria has been feeding it to him in steady doses. You may feel that our life together was one-sided, that your sacrifices went unnoticed. I pray you know that is not true. Your decision to support my dream was the greatest gift I ever received. But I never wanted you to extinguish your own flame. Your art, your brilliant eye, your sharp mind, they were always part of what made our company successful. You were my silent partner in everything. I was never just William Bennett. I was one half of William and Eleanor. Whatever you choose to do, know this. You have my complete faith. This fortune is not just my legacy, it is ours. You helped build it. You have every right to it and every right to defend it. Do not let anyone make you feel small. Do not let them erase you. You are and always have been a queen. All my love for all time, William." I sank into his leather chair, the letter clutched to my chest, and I wept. I wept for my loss, for my son's lost soul, and for the beautiful, unwavering love of this man who had known me better than I knew myself. He had seen my insecurities, my fears that I had become nothing more than a rich man's wife, and he had loved me through them. He had left me not just a fortune, but a validation of my entire life. The tears were a baptism. They washed away the last of my fear and hesitation. I was not just a grieving widow. I was not just a scorned mother. I was Eleanor Bennett, co-founder of an empire, guardian of a legacy, and the executor of my husband's last wish. I stood up and walked to my closet. I pushed past the rose, black, and navy suits. My fingers found the soft silk of the crimson dress. I pulled it out and laid it carefully on the bed. Tomorrow, I would not be dressing for a funeral. I would be dressing for battle. I finally fell asleep in the early hours of the morning, not in our large empty bed, but in William's worn leather chair in the study, his letter held safely in my hand. For the first time since he died, I did not feel alone. I felt his love, his faith, his strength surrounding me like a suit of armor. And I was ready. The next morning, I awoke with a sense of calm clarity. I showered, did my makeup with meticulous care, and stepped into a simple, elegant, cream-colored pantsuit. It was the kind of outfit I would have worn to a board meeting. Professional, powerful, and utterly devoid of weakness. The red dress had been for the funeral, a statement of love and defiance. Today was about business. I arrived at Thomas Whitmore's office at precisely 10 o'clock. The reception area was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. The receptionist gave me a small, encouraging smile as she led me to the main conference room. It was a large, imposing room dominated by a long, polished mahogany table. The wall behind it was a window overlooking the city, the skyline sharp and clear against the morning sun. They were all already there, seated on one side of the table like a royal court awaiting their coronation. Michael sat in the center, looking smug and important in a perfectly tailored suit. Victoria was beside him, a vision in black, a predatory stillness about her. Next to them sat my in-law, Carol, her face a mask of pious support for her nephew. And to my surprise, Michael had indeed invited his friend David and the investor he'd been so proud of, Marcus Thorne. They were his audience, his witnesses to the moment he would officially become the man in charge. They all stopped talking when I entered. 6 pairs of eyes fixed on me. I could feel their collective judgment, their surprise at my composed appearance. They had expected a distraught widow in black, not this calm, collected woman in cream. "Good morning," I said, my voice even and clear as I took the single empty seat on the opposite side of the table, directly across from Michael. Thomas sat at the head of the table, a neutral arbiter in this silent war. "Mom," Michael said, a hint of irritation in his tone, "glad you could make it on time." I simply nodded, placing my purse on the floor beside me. I met his gaze across the polished wood. There was no warmth there, no flicker of the boy I had raised. Only the cold ambition of a stranger. Thomas cleared his throat, bringing the room to order. He held up a thick, sealed document. "We are gathered here today for the formal reading of the last will and testament of William Bennett, executed on March 12th of this year." Victoria shifted in her seat, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Michael leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, the picture of a man ready to claim his destiny. Thomas began to read, his voice a steady drone of legal terminology. He detailed William's assets, the company's shares, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolios. With every word, I could feel Michael's ego inflating, his posture straightening. He glanced at Marcus Thorne with a look that said, "See, this is who I am." "And now," Thomas said, reaching the final operative clauses, "we come to the bequests." The room was utterly silent. This was the moment. "To my sister, Carol Bennett, I leave the sum of $100,000 with my love and thanks for the years of family memories." Carol let out a small, satisfied sigh. It was a generous but not extravagant amount. Thomas continued, his eyes fixed on the page. "To my beloved son, Michael William Bennett." He paused for a heartbeat. Michael's smile widened. He was ready. Thomas took a breath and delivered the killing blow. To my beloved son, Michael William Bennett, I leave the sum of $1 to be paid from petty cash, along with this personal letter. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a physical thing, a vacuum that sucked all the air and arrogance out of the room. I watched my son's face. It was a slow motion collapse. The confident smirk faltered, then crumbled. His skin, moments before flush with triumph, turned a pasty, sickly white. Disbelief warred with confusion, then morphed into pure, unadulterated panic. Victoria's reaction was faster, sharper. Her head whipped around to stare at Michael, her perfectly made-up face contorting into a mask of pure fury. "What?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "What does that mean?" But Thomas wasn't finished. He looked directly at me, his expression softening for the first time. "And finally," he read,
"There is," Thomas said calmly, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "There is an older will, which your father superseded with this one 6 months ago. This is his final, legal, and binding testament." He slid the signed document across the table. "The signature is notarized. It is ironclad." Victoria let out a sound that was half gasp, half snarl. She turned on Michael, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was terrifying. "You fool," she spat, her voice low and vicious, all pretense of the grieving daughter-in-law gone. "You absolute incompetent fool. You told me it was a sure thing. You told me you had it handled." I did,"
Michael stammered, his face ashen. "I thought I did. Dad would never." It was then that the other shoe dropped. Marcus Thorne's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, his expression annoyed. Then his eyes widened in alarm. He looked at David, who was simultaneously checking his own phone. David's face went white. "What is it?" Michael asked, his voice cracking. "The SEC just froze TechCore's assets," David said, his voice barely a whisper, "pending an investigation into securities fraud. Marcus, they're clawing back all recent investments." Marcus Thorne stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He pointed a trembling finger at Michael. You told me you had the capital. You said the Bennett estate was backing this. You committed $25 million. Michael looked like he had been punched in the gut. I did, he stammered, his face ashen. "I thought I did. Dad would never." It was then that the other shoe dropped. Marcus Thorne's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, his expression annoyed. Then his eyes widened in alarm. He looked at David, who was simultaneously checking his own phone. David's face went white. "What is it?" Michael asked, his voice cracking. "The SEC just froze TechCore's assets," David said, his voice barely a whisper, "pending an investigation into securities fraud. Marcus, they're clawing back all recent investments." Marcus Thorne stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He pointed a trembling finger at Michael. You told me you had the capital. You said the Bennett estate was backing this. You committed $25 million. Michael looked like he had been punched in the gut. The money is coming." "What money?" Thorne roared, his face purple with rage. "This man just said you inherited $1. You've been playing me? You've been playing all of us?" The pieces were clicking into place for everyone in the room. The restaurant franchise leases Michael had signed, the down payment on the Miami condo Victoria had picked out, the $500,000 deposit he had wired to David, all of it was built on a fantasy. He hadn't just lost an inheritance, he had committed to tens of millions of dollars he did not have. He was facing not just humiliation, but financial ruin and potential criminal charges. It was in that moment of absolute chaos that I spoke for the first time. My voice was quiet, but it sliced through the noise like a scalpel. "He didn't have the money, Mr. Thorne," I said, looking directly at the furious investor. "My son has been overzealous." All eyes turned to me. I was no longer the invisible widow. I was the one person in the room with all the power. Michael stared at me, a dawning horror in his eyes. The dots were connecting, the fake portfolio, my feigned helplessness. He was finally seeing the trap he had so eagerly walked into. He whispered, his voice filled with a new kind of venom, the venom of the outsmarted. "You knew. You did this." I didn't flinch. I held his gaze. "No, Michael," I said, my voice cold and steady. "You did this to yourself. Your father saw who you had become. All I did was hold up a mirror." Then I turned my attention to Marcus Thorne, whose angry face was now tinged with a flicker of calculation. He was a shark, and he was smelling a new source of blood in the water. Me. "My husband always said you had a brilliant eye for opportunity, Mr. Thorne. He also said you sometimes showed poor judgment in your choice of partners." I allowed a small, knowing smile. "After I have had time to properly review my husband's and now my portfolio, perhaps you and I could have a conversation about a real investment opportunity, under new management, of course." Thorne's jaw dropped. He looked from Michael's pathetic, crumbling form to me, the calm, composed woman in charge. He was a businessman above all else. He recognized power when he saw it. He gave a short, sharp nod. "I would like that very much, Mrs. Bennett." That was the final, killing blow for Michael. I hadn't just taken his money, I had taken his power, his future, his very identity as his father's successor, right in front of the men he had tried so desperately to impress. Victoria, seeing her last hope evaporate, stood up. She grabbed her ridiculously expensive handbag, the leather creaking in the silent room. She didn't even look at Michael. "I'll be sending my lawyer," she said, her voice dripping with ice, and then she walked out, her heels clicking in angry rhythm on the marble floor without a single backward glance at the man whose life she had just helped detonate. The divorce had already begun. The aftermath of the will reading was swift and brutal. The conference room, once a stage for Michael's coronation, became a tomb for his ambition. After Victoria stormed out, followed by a fuming Marcus Thorne and a shell-shocked David, only the four of us remained. Me, Thomas, Michael, and Carol. Carol was the first to break the silence. She looked at me, her face a strange mixture of pity and resentment. "Eleanor, how could you?" she whispered. "He's your son." "This wasn't my decision, Carol," I replied, weary but firm. "This was William's. He wanted to teach his son a lesson about respect and gratitude. It seems it was long overdue." But Michael wasn't listening. He was staring at the single envelope on the table, the one containing his father's letter. With trembling hands, he reached for it. He tore it open, his eyes scanning the page. I watched his face shift from anger to shame and finally to a deep, gut-wrenching sorrow. He let out a choked sob and buried his face in his hands. The arrogant man was gone, and in his place was a broken boy. I wanted to feel a surge of triumph, a satisfying sense of victory. But looking at my son, shattered and weeping, all I felt was a profound sadness. This was the wreckage of our family. Thomas, ever the professional, quietly began gathering the documents. "Michael, you are facing some serious legal and financial repercussions. I can no longer represent you, but I urge you to find a competent lawyer immediately." Michael didn't respond. He just sat there, shaking. I stood up. "I'll leave you to it, Thomas," and walked out of the room without looking at my son again. It was the only way I could keep from going to him, from trying to fix what he himself had to mend. The month that followed was a blur of legal meetings and financial briefings. I stepped into my new role as the head of Bennett Enterprises with a focus I hadn't realized I possessed. The skills I had honed over decades as a partner, a hostess, a strategist, and a manager of our complex household translated surprisingly well to the boardroom. I wasn't William, but I didn't have to be. I was Eleanor, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. I learned the full extent of Michael's folly. He had signed legally binding contracts for the restaurant leases. He had non-refundable deposits on everything from the Miami condo to a fleet of company cars. The lawsuits started piling up. He was forced to declare bankruptcy.
Victoria filed for divorce within a week. Their shared bank accounts were empty, drained by her before she disappeared. She fought for everything, but there was nothing left to fight for. The court awarded her half of nothing. I didn't abandon my son completely, but I knew that a simple bailout would negate William's entire lesson. Through Thomas, I arranged for a small, anonymous trust to pay for a modest one-bedroom apartment for him and a series of sessions with a therapist. Attached was a simple, unsigned note. "A foundation is for building on. The work is up to you." I sold our large family home. It was filled with too many ghosts, too many painful memories. I bought a chic, modern apartment downtown, overlooking the park. It was mine, a space I filled with light, art, and music. I started painting again, setting up a small studio in the second bedroom. The colors felt brighter, the canvases more welcoming. My friendship with Sarah healed. When I finally told her the whole story, she just listened, holding my hand. When I finished, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "William would have been so proud of you, Ellie," she said. "He always knew you were a warrior." Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. I was in control of my own life, my own finances, my own happiness. I had lost a husband and, in a way, I had lost a son. But in the process, I had found myself again. 2 years passed. 2 years of quiet rebuilding, both for me and, as it turned out, for Michael.
I poured my energy into a new venture. Using a portion of the estate, I established the William Bennett Foundation for the Arts, a nonprofit dedicated to providing grants and studio space for emerging young artists. I had revived my own dream by helping others achieve theirs. It was a legacy that felt true to both William and me. My contact with Michael was non-existent, except for the letters. They started arriving about 6 months after the will reading. The first one was angry, filled with blame and self-pity. I read it and threw it away. The second, a month later, was sullen and resentful. I kept that one, tucking it into a drawer. But then, the tone began to change. The letters became less about his misfortune and more about his actions. He wrote about his therapy sessions. He wrote about his job. He had gotten a job with a construction crew, starting at the bottom, doing manual labor. His first salary was barely enough to cover his rent. He described the exhaustion in his bones at the end of the day, the simple satisfaction of building something real with his own hands. He never asked for money. He never asked for forgiveness. He just wrote. He told me about paying back his first small debt to a supplier he had misled. He told me about the shame he felt when he saw people he once knew, how he now avoided their gaze. I used to think Dad's respect was my birthright, he wrote in one letter about a year in. I see now that it's something he earned every single day, and it's something I threw away. I didn't just lose an inheritance, Mom. I lost myself. I'm trying to find my way back. I read every letter, my heart aching with a complex mix of sorrow, pride, and a fragile, hesitant hope. This was the lesson. This slow, painful, unglamorous journey was what William had wanted for him. Not to destroy him, but to force him to rebuild himself from the ground up on a foundation of humility and hard work. On the second anniversary of William's death, a final letter arrived. It was short. Mom, there's nothing I can write that will undo the pain I caused you. I know that. The words I said at the funeral will haunt me forever. They were the words of a spoiled, cruel child, not a man. I'm trying to become a man my father would recognize. I don't expect you to forgive me. I haven't earned that. But I would like, if you would ever be willing, to tell you I'm sorry in person, to look you in the eye and take responsibility. If the answer is no, I will understand, and I will never ask again. Michael. I held the letter for a long time. The anger had long since faded, replaced by a deep, maternal ache. He was still my son. I thought about William's letter to me, the one from the rosewood box. He had written, "You are a queen." A queen, I mused, isn't just about power and retribution. She is also about grace and, when it is earned, mercy. The next day, I picked up my phone and sent a text message to the number at the top of his letter. Michael, there is a small coffee shop on the corner of 8th and Maple. I will be there tomorrow at 3 p.m. The reply came almost instantly. Thank you. I'll be there. I arrived at the coffee shop first, choosing a small, quiet table in the corner. I was nervous, my hands cold. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by simple jeans and a worn work jacket. He was thinner, his face weathered from working outdoors. The arrogance was gone from his posture, replaced by a quiet hesitation. He saw me and stopped, his eyes meeting mine across the room. He walked to the table and stood there, not sitting down. Mom, he said, his voice quiet, raspy. Thank you for coming. I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in 2 years. I saw the shame in his eyes, but underneath it I saw a flicker of something new, something solid, something real. Hello, Michael, I said, my voice softer than I expected. Sit down. He sat, his hands resting awkwardly on the table. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking, for everything. I listened as he talked, as he haltingly explained the depths of his shame, his misplaced resentment, his weakness in the face of Victoria's manipulations. He made no excuses. He simply owned his failure. When he was finished, a long silence settled between us. The future of our relationship hung in that quiet space. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. His were calloused and rough from his work. He flinched at my touch, then relaxed, and tears welled up in his eyes. "Your father's lesson was about the value of earning your own way, Michael," I said gently. "The journey to redemption is a long one." I paused, letting him meet my gaze. "But today," I said, giving his hand a small squeeze, "today you took the second step, and I was here to see it." A single tear rolled down his cheek. It wasn't the tear of a broken boy, but of a man beginning to heal. Our journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were finally walking in the same direction.